In the last 4 years, builders put up 14,806 apartment units in Colorado Springs. That's more than what got built between 2000 and 2021 combined, all in one metro area. And now, all that new supply just did something nobody was predicting a couple years ago. By the end of 2025, the average rent in Colorado Springs dropped below $1,400 a month, the first time that's happened since the second quarter of 2021. If you were paying attention to this market back in 2022, that number probably surprises you. Back then, this was one of the hardest rental markets in the country to break into, especially if you were a military family getting new orders to Fort Carson. So what actually happened here? Let's walk through it. Quick thing before we get into it, if you like breaking down real housing numbers instead of guesses and headlines, go ahead and subscribe. This channel does one of these every week, and it's all sourced, no fluff. Here's the short version. Colorado Springs has been one of the fastest-growing metro areas in the state for the better part of a decade. Population hit around 709,000 in 2025, and it's still climbing. A big chunk of that growth is military. Fort Carson alone, along with its training site, supports roughly 64,750 personnel and family members. For years, demand outran supply. Builders saw that and reacted the way builders usually do. They built. A lot. Laura Nelson, who runs the Apartment Association of Southern Colorado, has pointed out that the pace of construction over the past 4 years outpaced 2 full decades before it. That kind of building boom takes a while to show up in rent prices, but eventually it does, and 2026 is the year it caught up. Let's get into the actual data, because this is where the story really lives. As of July 2026, average rent across Colorado Springs sits right around $1,845 a month citywide, according to Zumper's market data, which is about 5% below the national average. Look at apartments specifically, and Rent Cafe has that number closer to $1,518, down slightly from the year before. Some neighborhoods have swung even harder. Peregrine dropped 59.5% year over year to $1,377 a month, and Broadmoor Oaks fell 55.1% to $1,749. Those are extreme, localized examples, but they show what happens when a neighborhood gets flooded with new units at once. On the buying side, the median home price in the area is sitting around $500,000, basically flat compared to last year, with the average sale price closer to $577,600. Homes are taking longer to sell, too, 45 days on average in June 2026, which is 12% slower than the year before. Inventory is sitting at about a 3.3-month supply. That's still below the 6-month mark that usually signals a fully balanced market, but it's the most inventory the area has seen in over a decade. Put it together, and you get a market that's cooling on both sides, rentals and home sales at the same time. This is where the story gets personal, because for a long stretch, military families in Colorado Springs were the ones absorbing the worst of this market. Back in 2022, an Associated Press data analysis using Zillow numbers found that rents across 5 major military markets, including Colorado Springs, had jumped 43.9% since 2018, while Basic Allowance for Housing, BAH, had only gone up 18.7% in that same window. Families were closing that gap out of pocket, sometimes running into the thousands of dollars a year. Fast forward to 2026, and the Department of Defense increased BAH nationally by 4.2%, effective January 1st. Fort Carson's specific rate went up by a smaller 2.1% from 2025 to 2026, which on its own sounds like military families are still falling behind. But because rents in Colorado Springs have actually leveled off or dropped in the same window, that gap isn't widening the way it was a few years ago. In a lot of cases, it's finally holding steady, or even closing a little. That's a real shift. For a family getting PCS orders into Fort Carson this year, the math looks noticeably different than it did for a family moving in during 2022. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. When rents drop and vacancies climb, Landlords don't just sit there and lower prices quietly. They compete. Property managers in Colorado Springs have started offering serious incentives to fill units, 6 to 8 weeks of free rent on some leases, help covering moving costs, and free parking or amenity credits thrown in. That's not something you typically see in a landlord's market. That's what a market looks like when the supply finally caught up to demand, and then some. At the same time, builders have pulled back. Multifamily construction has slowed noticeably since 2024, and most of what's still coming online is concentrated in the west and north parts of the city. So the incentives happening right now may not last forever. If new construction keeps slowing while population keeps growing, some of this current breathing room for renters could tighten back up. As of this month, Colorado Springs looks like a market that's genuinely trying to find its footing after years of being lopsided in one direction. Rents have pulled back to levels not seen since 2021. Home prices have basically flatlined for 4 straight years. Inventory is the highest it's been in a decade, even if it's not quite balanced by the textbook definition yet. For renters, and especially for military families who spent the last few years absorbing rent increases their housing allowance couldn't keep up with, this is the first real relief this market has offered in a long time. Here's the thing worth sitting with. This same market 3 years ago was the one making national headlines for squeezing military families out of their own housing allowance. Now it's one of the more forgiving rental markets in the country, relative to where it just came from. Markets like this don't stay still for long. Builders are already pulling back, population is still climbing, and whether this window stays open for renters or starts closing again is going to depend on which of those two forces wins out first. If you're watching this market as a renter, a buyer, or someone stationed here on orders, that's the number to keep an eye on going forward. Not the sticker price today, but which direction supply and demand are heading next.